There's a kind of man who stands differently, a man who's learned that his strength doesn't come from a crowd, but from his Creator. He's not chasing approval, applause, or companionship to feel secure. Why? Because he knows God exists within him and not from superficial things. This man is rare. This man walks with quiet confidence. This man might not have a long list of friends or admirers, but make no mistake, he is a very, very secure man. Today we're diving into the kind of strength that doesn't need an audience. We're talking about a man who has learned to stand alone, with God as his companion, his guide, and his source of unwavering confidence. It's not about rejecting friendships or living isolated. It's about becoming so secure in who you are, in Christ, that no one, no friend, no critic, no crowd can define your worth. This isn't loneliness, it's power. And by the end of this message, you'll see why walking this path might be the most freeing thing you'll ever do. But before we continue, please give this video a thumbs up and write in the comments, God is always with me. Solitude is a word that often makes people uncomfortable. For many, it brings thoughts of loneliness, isolation, and even failure. After all, isn't being surrounded by people and activity a sign of success and fulfillment? Society tells us that the more friends we have, the more popular we are, the more validated we feel, the better. But the truth is, solitude is not a punishment. It's a gift. It's in solitude that a man discovers who he truly is, beneath the expectations, the noise, and the masks we so often wear. The fear of being alone is rooted in one simple reality. Most people are terrified of looking in the mirror, not the kind of mirror that reflects your physical image, but the mirror of your soul. In the quiet of solitude, there's nowhere to hide. There's no one to distract you from your thoughts, no noise to drown out your doubts, no applause to reassure you. It's just you, and that's what scares people. The idea of facing themselves without the crutch of someone else's approval or presence. But a man who embraces solitude is different. He has the courage to face the questions that most people avoid. Who am I? What am I afraid of? Where am I going? And why? He doesn't run from the silence, he leans into it, because he understands that true strength isn't found in the crowd, it's found in the stillness. Solitude forces us to face ourselves, and in doing so, it reveals both our weaknesses and our strengths. Most people avoid that kind of self-reflection because it's uncomfortable. Who wants to sit with their fears and regrets, examining the things they'd rather ignore? But a man who dares to spend time in solitude understands that growth begins with honesty. You can't fix what you won't face. You can't be strong if you're unwilling to admit where you're weak. In solitude, you learn things about yourself that no one else can teach you. You start to see the patterns of your thoughts, the true motivations behind your actions, and the areas where you've been fooling yourself. A man who embraces this process isn't afraid of what he finds, because he knows that God is with him in the silence. And with God, there's no condemnation, only the opportunity to grow. Imagine a sculptor standing in front of a rough block of marble. At first glance, the marble looks ordinary, unremarkable, but the sculptor sees something within it, something beautiful, something unique. With each strike of the chisel, he removes what doesn't belong, shaping the stone into a masterpiece. That's what solitude does for a man. It's the chisel God uses to remove the unnecessary, to refine and reveal the man he created you to be. Of course, solitude isn't always easy. It strips away the distractions and demands your attention. It forces you to confront what you've been running from, your fears, your failures, your insecurities. And yet it's in that very confrontation that transformation begins. When you stop running, you start growing. When you stop pretending, you start healing. When you stop seeking approval from the world, you start finding your worth in God. Take Elijah, for example. When he fled to the wilderness, exhausted and discouraged, he found himself alone in a cave. He expected to hear God's voice in dramatic ways, in the wind, the earthquake, the fire. But God wasn't in any of those things. Instead, God spoke to Elijah in a gentle whisper. That's what solitude does. It quiets the noise of the world so you can hear the voice of God. And in that whisper, you find direction, strength, and peace. A man who embraces solitude doesn't rely on others to define him. He's not waiting for someone else to tell him he's worthy or successful. He's already found those answers in the quiet moments with God. His identity isn't wrapped up in how many friends he has or how popular he is. It's rooted in the unshakable truth of who God says he is. That kind of man doesn't need applause to feel confident. He doesn't need a crowd to feel strong. He's anchored in something deeper, something eternal. This kind of self-awareness and security is rare. Most people are too busy chasing validation from others to stop and ask themselves, who am I really? They fill their lives with noise and activity, afraid of what the silence might reveal. But a man who chooses solitude understands that it's in the silence that you find clarity. It's in the quiet moments that you hear your own voice, and more importantly, God's voice. When you take the time to be alone with God, something extraordinary happens. You start to see yourself the way He sees you. You realize that your worth isn't tied to your achievements, your relationships, or your reputation. It's tied to the fact that you are His, and when that truth sinks in, you become unshakable. You stop looking for validation in the wrong places. You stop comparing yourself to others. You stop needing people to tell you that you're enough, because you already know you are. The man who's comfortable in solitude isn't lacking. He's not incomplete or missing out. On the contrary, he's discovered a strength that most people never find. He's found peace in his own company because he's made peace with himself and with God. He's looked in the mirror, confronted his fears, and allowed God to refine him. And because of that, he's free from the need to perform, to impress, to seek approval. He's free to simply be. Strength is one of those words people throw around easily, but few truly understand what it means. In today's world, strength often gets confused with how much you can lift, how loud you can talk, or how many people admire you. But real strength, the kind that doesn't waver in the face of trials, that doesn't crumble when the applause stops, is built in solitude. It's built when no one else is around to prop you up, and it's forged when you face life's challenges alone with nothing but your faith and your resolve. A man who embraces solitude knows that it isn't weakness to stand alone. It's a sign of resilience, discipline, and focus. The solitude he seeks isn't about isolation or pushing people away. It's about stepping into the quiet, stripping away the noise, and confronting the battles within himself. Those battles, fears, insecurities, doubts, are where true strength is formed. Most people spend their lives leaning on others to help them feel strong. They lean on friendships, relationships, and social validation to bolster their confidence. And when those external sources of strength are taken away, they're left feeling hollow and unsure of who they are. But the man who has learned to stand in solitude isn't reliant on those things. His strength isn't borrowed from the people around him. It's something he's built within himself, and because of that, it's unshakable. When you're alone, when it's just you and your thoughts, there's no room for pretending. In solitude, you're stripped down to your truest self. The good, the bad, the unresolved, all of it rises to the surface. And for a man willing to face that, solitude becomes the greatest teacher he'll ever have. A man who spends time in solitude learns to deal with the fears and insecurities that others try to drown out with noise. He's not afraid to sit with the questions that most people avoid, like, what am I really afraid of? Or, am I living in alignment with my values? He knows that the answers to those questions won't be easy, but they're essential, because it's in answering them that he grows. This kind of growth can't happen in a crowd. When you're surrounded by people, it's easy to hide behind their opinions, to let their presence shield you from your own weaknesses. But in solitude, there's no one to hide behind. A man who embraces solitude uses this time to confront himself, to face his flaws head-on, and to emerge stronger because of it. There's a quiet power in reflection, in looking back at your life and owning both the victories and the failures. A man who spends time alone with his thoughts learns to acknowledge his mistakes without letting them define him. He doesn't run from his regrets or try to bury them. He uses them as stepping stones. Think about it. How many people spend their entire lives trying to escape their past? They avoid being alone because they don't want to face the things they've done or the person they've become. But a man who's spent time in solitude understands that his past doesn't have to dictate his future. He's willing to look at his missteps, learn from them, and grow. That's real strength, the ability to confront your weaknesses and use them as fuel for transformation. The Apostle Paul is a perfect example of this. Before his conversion, Paul was a man who persecuted Christians. But after his encounter with Christ, Paul spent time in solitude, reflecting, learning, and allowing God to shape him into the man he was called to be. That period of reflection and transformation didn't weaken him. It became the foundation for his strength as one of the greatest apostles. True strength isn't just about power, it's also about peace. A man who's built strength in solitude has a kind of inner peace that can't be shaken by the chaos of the world. He's not easily swayed by the opinions of others, nor is he rattled by life's challenges. Why? Because he's faced the storms within himself, and he's come out stronger. When you spend time alone, you learn to listen to your own voice, to sort through your fears, your doubts, and your dreams. And when you've done that, no one else's voice has the power to drown you out. The man who has built strength in solitude knows who he is, and he walks with confidence because of it. This kind of peace is rare. Most people are so caught up in the noise of life that they never take the time to quiet their minds and find their center. But the man who embraces solitude values his peace too much to sacrifice it. He's not afraid to say no to things or people that disrupt that peace. He's selective about who he lets into his life because he knows that the wrong relationships can weaken him while the right ones will strengthen him. A man who's built strength in solitude understands that not all friendships are good friendships. He's not looking for people to validate him or fill an emotional void. He's already done the work of becoming secure in who he is, so he's not desperate to keep people around who drain his energy or disrespect his boundaries. This doesn't mean he's cold or disconnected. In fact, he values connection deeply, but he values it enough to be selective. He's not interested in superficial relationships or people who bring unnecessary drama into his life. He knows that every relationship carries an influence, and he's careful about the kind of influence he allows. It's this selectiveness that sets him apart. While others might see his smaller circle of friends as a weakness, he knows it's a strength. He's not counting friends to measure his worth. Instead, he's focused on building relationships that align with his values, relationships that strengthen his character rather than compromise it. A man who's built strength in solitude doesn't need a crowd to feel validated. He doesn't rely on others to tell him who he is or what he's worth. His strength comes from within, from the battles he's faced in private and the victories he's won in silence. When life throws challenges his way, he doesn't crumble because he's already been tested in ways most people can't imagine. He's walked through the fire of self-reflection, faced his fears, and come out stronger. The world may look at a man like this and not understand him. They might see his solitude as a sign of weakness or assume he's missing something. But the truth is, he's not missing anything. He's found something deeper, something richer than what the world has to offer. He's found a strength that doesn't depend on anyone else, a strength that's quiet, steady, and unshakable. Sometimes, building strength in solitude means walking a quieter path. It means being comfortable with moments of silence, with seasons where you're not surrounded by people or activity. For many, this would feel lonely, but for a man who's secure in himself, it's liberating. When you're alone, you have the freedom to grow without distraction. You have the space to think clearly, to make decisions that align with your purpose. And when you've spent time walking that path, you develop a kind of unshakable confidence. The world we live in is full of distractions. Every day there's a new demand for your attention, a new trend to follow, a new expectation to meet, a new group of people to impress. Most people spend their lives pulled in a dozen directions, trying to keep everyone happy and fit into a mold that was never meant for them. But the man who's comfortable in solitude has freed himself from those distractions. He's not chasing the latest trend or worrying about keeping up appearances. He knows that real fulfillment doesn't come from being seen or liked. It comes from walking in alignment with his purpose. You see, solitude clears the path for focus. When you're alone, when you're not constantly surrounded by people and their opinions, you can hear yourself think. You can hear God speak, and that's where clarity begins. The man who spends time in solitude understands that every moment he spends distracted by the noise of the world is a moment lost from pursuing his true calling. He doesn't need the crowd's approval to feel secure because he's not living for their approval. His eyes are set on something greater, a purpose that goes beyond the here and now, beyond popularity, and beyond the fleeting applause of people. A man who's aligned with his purpose doesn't measure his success by how many people know his name or how many friends he has. He understands that his worth isn't tied to his social circle or the number of people who follow his journey. While the world places value on popularity, he places value on authenticity. This man is not interested in superficial connections. He's not collecting people just to avoid being alone. Instead, he's focused on building a life that reflects his values, a life that honors God and fulfills the unique mission he's been given. He's not here to impress people. He's here to walk the path God has set before him, even if that means walking it alone. Think about Noah. In a world that was corrupt and broken, Noah was called to build an ark, a task that probably made him the subject of ridicule and isolation. But Noah wasn't distracted by what others thought. He wasn't trying to fit in or gain anyone's approval. His focus was on obeying God, on fulfilling the purpose he had been given, no matter how lonely or misunderstood that path might have been. When a man is aligned with his purpose, he becomes very selective about how he spends his time and who he allows into his life. He's not quick to say yes to every opportunity or every relationship, because he knows that not everything is meant to be part of his journey. He's learned the power of saying no, not out of arrogance, but out of respect for his peace and his mission. There's a confidence in a man who knows what he stands for. He's not swayed by the opinions of others or pressured into doing things that don't align with his purpose. He's focused on his calling, and he's not willing to compromise that for the sake of fitting in. This man is like a tree planted by streams of water. His roots run deep, and he's not easily moved by the storms of life. He's not chasing after approval or bending to fit someone else's expectations, because his strength and security come from within. His purpose keeps him grounded, and his solitude gives him the space to stay focused. For a man aligned with his purpose, solitude becomes a sanctuary. It's a place where he can retreat to recharge, to reflect, and to reconnect with God. While others might see solitude as emptiness, he sees it as richness. It's in those quiet moments that he finds clarity and direction. The noise of the world can be overwhelming, and it's easy to lose sight of your purpose when you're constantly surrounded by it. But solitude offers a break from the noise. It's in the silence that you can hear God's whisper, the gentle nudge that reminds you of who you are and what you're here to do. Elijah experienced this in a very real way. After fleeing to the wilderness, Elijah found himself alone, discouraged, and searching for answers. God didn't speak to him in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. Instead, God spoke in a still, small voice. That's the power of solitude. It creates space for you to hear the voice that truly matters. A man who embraces solitude and aligns with his purpose isn't swayed by the ups and downs of life. He knows that his value isn't determined by the opinions of others or the size of his social circle. He's not measuring his life by how many people approve of him or how successful he looks from the outside. Instead, he's focused on the bigger picture, the legacy he's building, the values he's standing by, and the impact he's making for the kingdom of God. This kind of man doesn't need to be busy all the time to feel important. He doesn't need to be surrounded by people to feel valued. He's secure in his purpose, and that security gives him the freedom to live intentionally. He's not afraid to take the quieter path if it means staying true to himself. While others might rush to fill their lives with noise and activity, he's content to walk in the quiet, knowing that his purpose is guiding him every step of the way. There's a profound peace that comes from knowing you're walking the path God has set for you. A man who's aligned with his purpose doesn't feel the need to prove himself to anyone. He doesn't need applause or validation because he knows he's exactly where he's meant to be. This peace doesn't mean life is easy. It means life is focused. When challenges come, he faces them with the strength that comes from knowing his purpose. When people misunderstand him or criticize him, he doesn't waver because his worth isn't tied to their opinions. This man walks with quiet confidence, not because he's perfect, but because he's grounded. He knows that his value comes from God, and his mission is to live a life that reflects that truth. This is not loneliness, it's power, it's freedom. It's the ability to walk a path that honors God, no matter how misunderstood or different it may seem. A secure man knows his worth, not because of what others say, but because of what God says about him. In his stillness, he hears God's whisper, guiding him forward. Thank you for watching the video. If it has inspired you, share it with someone who might need encouragement today. God bless you all eternally. Remember, in the silence, God is near.